Okay, the channel is live. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Watching 100 Movies. I am Christiana Ellis,
Hello, I'm Mike Mateen.
and tonight we are watching a pair of films from the Sight and Sound magazine's top 100 movies of all time. We chose just a pair of movies that we felt like seeing. One that I think neither of us had seen before, and one that both of us had seen before, but perhaps not in a while. We're going to be talking about Portrait of a Lady on Fire and There Will Be Blood. So,
Yep.
do you have one of those that you're just raring to go on, or?
Uh, no. I mean,
All right.
I enjoyed watching them both.
Yeah, me too. One of the things that I thought was interesting, and I'm sure we'll touch on this some more, is that in some respects, without any sort of a plan, because we each just picked one of the movies, we ended up with a movie that is almost entirely female cast and largely about women who don't have much use for men, and then the other movie is an almost entirely male cast about men who don't have much use for women.
Yes.
Just by coincidence, we ended up doing that. I thought that was interesting.
Yeah. The other thing I thought was interesting is that both of these films take like a very classical storytelling trope or framework and just alter it in a slight way, like right, like or it was some of them more dramatic. Like so, There Will Be Blood takes the very kind of epic Homer, hero's journey of having some trials and finding success, and switches it like to like not just a normal anti-hero story, but like directly contradicts kind of all these things like the descent that this man has compared to like maybe even like Goodfellas, right? And because
Mm-hmm.
and I think part of it is what you identified, it's so focused on just this small worldview, like there's no one else in his world. But like at the end of a hero's journey, after going through all the trials, you become a better person and you bring, boons to your fellow man, right? Like whether
Mm-hmm.
it's your people, the society at large. And in this, he ends up like actually taking a life at the end of it, right? Like,
Mm-hmm.
and and like even the final line, I'm finished, like
Mm-hmm.
it's a complete dissent in complete opposition to how that works. And then the other one is a very classic star-crossed lovers, can't be together
Mm-hmm.
for a reason, but just enjoy the time they have and kind of reflect, all that, very classical,
Yeah.
except that they are, two women in a time when that wasn't necessarily like it's not the
Mm-hmm.
only reason they can't be
Well,
together,
right.
but
Like
it's
I think
part of it. Yeah.
it's a little bit interesting, especially just given the time period that like the idea that anyone might think it is improper for two women to be in love is really not even addressed.
No,
Like
that's
the
not the
reason
reason.
they can't be together is not that. It is the fact that for economic slash political reasons, one of them is having to get married in an arranged marriage.
Right. So this would have had this been a male female story with the exact same framework, it wouldn't have changed
Mm-hmm.
the again the framework that
Right,
much,
like
right?
the
What
reason
happens.
for
Yeah.
them being star-crossed in this way is actually not that they're both women, and yet the fact that they are is kind of crucial to the way it's told.
Right. And so you get a different type of story because their relationship is different. Them as characters are different because they fit different, kind
Mm-hmm.
of molds. And so it makes it really interesting to watch this standard, again, framework unfold. But what makes the movie interesting isn't that we're following that classical storytelling. It's that the characters and some of the other pieces, the cinematography, the location, like all that stuff, just makes it draws you in
Mm-hmm.
that as opposed to the story it's telling,
Yeah,
right?
it's funny too that you evoked Homer in There Will Be Blood because Portrait of a Lady on Fire also uses some mythic inspiration with the parallels to the story of Orpheus and Eurydice.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
didn't go back that far. I was thinking more of the Romeo Juliet, but
Mm-hmm.
without the the death part.
Right. Well,
You
because
know,
the Orpheus and Eurydice, it's not even just like a parallel. I mean, it's text. They talk about it. It's like relevant to the characters in the story.
yeah,
Not just something for us to observe, but literally they talk about it.
which makes sense. I probably caught that and processed it without actually like noting it down.
Sure, sure. Well, in any case, let's go ahead and just start with Portrait of a Lady on Fire, just to and get into it.
Hmm.
So, this movie is a 2019 movie. Wait, is that right? Hang on. It's a 2019 movie, yeah, and it is a French language movie, although it actually also has a lot of Italian in it, right? I mean, for me, I'm kind of, reading the subtitles all the time anyway. But that was my impression, is that they kind of go back and forth some.
That is correct. Yes.
Yeah, and so it is a movie that won a whole lot of international awards and then was entirely snubbed or let's say instead of snubbed, let's say overlooked by the Oscars that year. We will definitely be talking a little bit about the Oscars later after these two films, but it is directed by Celine Sciamma, and also written by her, and it is about a woman who is a painter who has been hired to paint a portrait. And when she shows up on this little remote island that seems to have very little except a big manor house on it, presumably there is also a small village of some kind, but we really don't ever see it except that we see some of the people who live there show up sometimes, but we don't ever even go to the village. We don't see it on screen. And she discovers once there that she has an unusual job painting this portrait because it is a portrait of someone who refuses to pose and refuses to be painted because the painting is intended to be sent to the arranged husband to be for this woman who doesn't want to get married, but the portrait is to send to him to basically say this is who you're going to be marrying. And so because she won't pose, the job she is assigned is you're going to pretend to just be her companion to go on walks with her, but you're going to be painting her in secret. And she is not really in much of a position to refuse at this point. I mean, she could, but she is also trying to make a living as an artist. She doesn't know this woman yet, and so she kind of just agrees. She's already traveled by ship out to this little tiny island. But then, as she comes to know this woman, um, they begin to connect, they begin to relate to one another, and eventually they fall in love. And then all of this is uh, got some side stories with the young maid who also works at the house, and the mother of the woman who's going to be in the arranged marriage, and some of the local women, and there's just this very lovely story. That so that's basically the plot. Um, there's a little bit of a framing device where we know that they're not going to end up together because what happens is the painter woman, we see her teaching a painting class, and someone brings out a painting of a woman standing on a beach with the skirts of her dress burning, thus the title. And apparently, this was a painting she had had stored away, and one of her students basically just found it and thought it was interesting and brought it out. And that inspires her to reflect on the rest of the story. But I had heard good things about it, but actually didn't know very much about what the story was. But I absolutely adored this movie.
Yeah, it took a minute to kind of draw me in. Nothing was wrong with the
Mm-hmm.
beginning. Um, just slow beats and kind of remote island and reading the subtitles. It just kind of, but as again, these characters, these two actresses in particular, are just, I mean, it's just infectious to watch them
Mm-hmm.
go through. And the idea of the girl doesn't want to be married. Like, isn't there part, like, doesn't she also think at one point that the reason that she's supposed to be like walking around with her is so she doesn't commit suicide?
Well, specifically, the two characters are Marianne, played by Noemi Merlant, who is the painter, and Adele Hanel, who plays Heloise, who is the woman who is going to in the arranged marriage. Heloise was not supposed to be the one in the arranged marriage. Her older sister was the one that was supposed to be in the arranged marriage, but
Right.
her older sister committed suicide, not explicitly, but presumably because she didn't want to be in the arranged marriage. And so now the countess, the mother of these two, has told Marianne part of why we want her to have an escort when she goes out walking is we're worried she might try the same thing.
Yep. Right.
And in fact, actually, the very first time they go out on a walk together, there's a moment where Heloise basically just takes off sprinting towards this cliff. And Marianne is just like, oh my gosh, am I going to fail this right away? And it turns out that she does not, in fact, intend to jump. She was just exhilarated by being able to leave the house for a first time in a while because her mom wouldn't let her leave the house when she didn't have someone to go on walks with her.
Right.
And so she was
That's
just
right.
excited
Part
to
of it.
be running.
Yeah, and then it just does such a good job of, and like I said, they do a really good job of watching this. Like they're going on these walks, but they don't just like become a same-sex couple, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like
Yeah.
they're still doing what was expected, right? Like she's
Mm-hmm.
befriending her
Right.
and
Well,
then going
it's
back and doing the painting, but like they can convey that there's definitely something more there,
yeah.
right? Like you feel the connection, and you're watching it, kind of the spark start to
Mm-hmm.
like this, like, again, I know the whole Port of the Lady on
Yeah.
Fire is because of her, like her catching fire at the bonfire, but it really is
Well, like
like
that's the
a
literal of
metaphor.
it, right? But
Yeah.
there's certainly
The,
there's several different layers of potential metaphorical, um, you know, uh, meaning there in
right.
what does it mean? Because again, I think part of what initially attracts Marianne to Heloise is that when presented with the story of what happened to her sister, who was sad, and she's reporting back to the mother saying, like whether she thinks it's really a risk or not that she might kill herself. She says she's not sad, she's angry. And that sort of righteous anger seems like that's part of what it is that initially attracts Marianne to her.
Right.
This feeling of like it's not fair that this is being done to her.
Yep.
And it's interesting too because certainly Heloise and her mother are presented as being very wealthy compared to anyone else on this island, probably compared to much of the world. But that's kind of the thing. It's almost a little bit like what we talked about with the Age of Innocence. It's the whole thing of like, and yet that is why the rules say she has to participate in this arranged marriage because that is how these families preserve their wealth and don't let it get frittered away, is by combining families and preserving and collecting the wealth all together. And so even though she is comfortable in sort of the tangible ways, she is not given really any choice in the matter. But the thing is, and this is like part of the story, she does theoretically have a choice, right? Like she could run away. Like if she was really determined to just escape and not go through with the marriage, they probably would not be able to stop her. And in fact, at a certain point, Marianne basically as much as suggests that she should. like not just run away generally, but run away with me. And she doesn't, right? And so she's mad about having to get married, but at the same time she does not choose the other alternatives that might be available to her, right?
Exactly.
And that is part of the tension, because even while they come to really care and even love each other, there is that tension because they know that, like, they won't be able to stay together, and Marianne can't help but resent a little bit that Heloise isn't willing to make that choice, which Marianne sees as the braver choice, like to be willing to leave all that behind. To be happy is the way Marianne would probably think of it. But, Heloise would put it kind of differently, in the sense of, like, there's a lot more to this than just my own personal circumstances or happiness, right? Like, there's a lot of other moving pieces that, because you've never been part of this, you don't really have a sense of, but I do, right? Like, if I run away, what happens to my mother? Like, I may be angry that I'm having to do this, but I also understand why it's happening and understand what the consequences would be to lots of people. Like, if she doesn't get married, how long will her mother be able to keep that house? What about the people who work at that house? What happens to the rest of the island if this family doesn't have the money coming in that way? Like, there's bigger things about it, right? And so that's not to say I'm necessarily saying she should have gone through with the marriage, but that was the choice that she makes. And it was not something that they, like, that couldn't have been decided another way.
Right. And I think that's what makes again, the star crossing part so
Mm-hmm.
interesting, is that she's she's not being selfish, right?
Yeah.
Like, she's not just doing what she wants
Mm-hmm.
and just to be happy, right? Like, and which, it's interesting because, like, it's a complicated feeling, because, like you said, you're right. She could have chosen not to do it.
Mm-hmm.
There are lots of reasons why she decided to stay, but the convoluted part is that that's what differentiates her from her sister, right? Like, her sister obviously took, like, the ultimate selfish act of, like, of
Mm-hmm.
just removing herself from the situation,
And certainly, I
putting
think,
grief on everybody else
yeah.
who is still there, right? And then also taking this all apart. But that's part of what draws Marianne to her, is this part of her personality, this sort of, this passion that is contained within this, like, selfless person. Like, it's
Mm-hmm.
just, like, it's so complicated, but it doesn't feel like that when you're watching it. Like,
Mm-hmm.
you don't you never watch this you don't watch this movie and say, like, you know Heloise, you're wrong, go be happy, or Marianne, you're wrong, you should support her. Like, you don't feel right or wrong about either
Yeah.
of them. Like, but you also don't really feel that conflicted, because, like, you kind of settle into, matter of fact, this is what's going to happen. They're going to
Yeah.
spend the 5 days together while her mom's gone, and then that's going to be it. And they're going
Mm-hmm.
to have to be okay with that in their lives. And watching them carry that out, and I love the fact that it tees us off at the beginning that that is in fact what's happening,
Right.
right? Like, you will not be with her,
We
right?
know from the framing device that it doesn't. They don't end up together.
Right. And so we are just under the assumption, which rightfully so,
Mm-hmm.
that this is going to end the way that it has been dictated that it will end, is that she will finish her job
Mm-hmm.
and she will leave, and they will not be together anymore, and their lives no longer intersect, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because it's very different. And to watch, like, again, to watch that develop within that, the kind of the passion they have for each other, but the acceptance
Mm-hmm.
of it, again, it's all told through, it's shown to us, right? It's not like we're not told this is what's happening.
Mm-hmm.
Like, we feel it. And that's what I think is, it's just hard to convey. Like, this is something, like, this movie does, it works, like, so much as a movie too, right? Like, the
Mm-hmm.
the visual, the
Oh yeah,
character, the, yeah, like, everything
beautiful
about it makes a
cinematography.
movie.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, this is a gorgeous film. That's another kind of commonality between the two, is that the cinematography of the natural environments and the interior environments of this both of these movies top notch.
Right. And how it actually like moves the story too. Like it's not just beautiful cinematography for the sake of cinematography. It's like it's painting this place as like sort of like they're in this fantasy world for
Hmm.
5 days,
Yeah.
right? And to Eloise, obviously that's just her normal world, but for
Hmm.
Marianne, this is a fantasy world, and we're kind of entering into this like moment in
Hmm.
time, and the
Well,
beauty of the scenery makes it feel like that,
yeah.
right?
Well, and even for Heloise, it becomes kind of a fantasy during that time because it's a time where she has a taste of what her life might be if it wasn't what it was.
Right. And
Yeah.
also the winding down of her time on that island
Yeah.
before she moved to Milan or wherever she's going,
Right. Yeah. Um, there's some interesting stuff too, just like as the relationship is starting to develop, because they've definitely started to feel some affection to with one another. But of course, as we mentioned initially, Marianne is there under false pretenses. She's not supposed to tell Heloise that she's painting her. She's having to like go out on walks and then like do quick little pencil sketches behind a tree, um, while Heloise is looking at the ocean or whatever, and then going back and like painting in her room at night. But eventually, she comes to feel bad enough about that deception that she tells the mother that's like, "Listen, I need you to let me be the one to tell her what's really happening." And it's made clear, it's kind of like, you're not going to do that before you finish it though, because we need you to still finish it.
Right.
But what's interesting there is that the scene where that's all happening, that sequence, because she has finished a portrait, but we can tell, not only looking at the painting, but looking at the way Marianne is acting about it, that she is not really satisfied with it. We look at that portrait and it does not look like Heloise. It looks like Heloise if Heloise was a different person. Not like a literal different person, but it's like a gentle smile on the face in the portrait. And yet we have never seen Heloise make that face. Heloise is angry, and the girl in this first portrait is not. And it we can tell that that's like not right. But in any case, the Countess is like, "Oh yeah, that's great." She's probably happier that it looks happy.
I
Um,
she's probably just happy that it's done,
right?
right?
Well, exactly. Like, for her, from her perspective, this whole deal is contingent on them sending this portrait to the presumed husband, and him saying, "Yes, that's good. Send her over." Right? And so that's the piece that's needed. That is what is holding this whole arrangement up. But so when Marianne finally confesses, Heloise is, of course, hurt, angry, but also she kind of had suspected that there was something a little funny. But there's also a little bit of attention because she had also been sensing like the romantic chemistry, and now she's confused. Is it possible she was misinterpreting that?
Right.
All of those looks, was it because she really wanted to look, or is it because it was her job to look? And it's all kind of confusing. And so she insists, she says, "I want to see it. I want to go see the portrait." And then when she does, she says she doesn't like it. And all of a sudden, Marianne is like, "What do you mean you don't like it?" It's like, are you, and there's an amazing exchange where Marianne says, "I didn't know you were an art critic." And Heloise says, "Well, I didn't know you were a painter." And then you're just like, "Oh, yeah. Yeah, she's got you there. That's a hard one to
Yep.
bounce back." But and that is where we get an amazing moment that like astounds, I think, probably everyone in the scene, Marianne included, where she spontaneously, in response to Heloise's reaction, ruins the painting. And of course the mom is mad, but she still needs the painting. And so if Marianne says, I will stay and it wasn't ready, it wasn't good enough, I can do it better. That is when we get this, okay, look, I'm leaving, leaving the island for 5 days. Whatever version of this painting you're going to do needs to be done when I get back. But this is the point where Heloise is thinking, if Marianne only was here for a job, why would she do that?
Yep.
And now they are able to finally engage with one another as equals, no false pretenses. And
well, I think there's another little like subtlety that happens like at
Mhm.
that time is it's not just that her mom is just like, okay, you can still have the job, right?
Mhm.
Eloise agrees to actually sit for the
Right.
painting. She
Yeah.
has that realization, and when the mom hears that, she's like shocked because she was obviously
She
one
had
point where
refused before. Like that
she had
that was the only
refused.
reason for the deception. Yeah.
Right. So Heloise like sees that Marianne's willing to sacrifice something she did for her,
Mhm.
and again, selfless manner, like then says, okay, well, I know I'm mad about this thing happening, but like if it helps
Mhm.
her stay
Yeah. Well,
and I can learn a little bit more about like what's going on with this, like
yeah.
I'll do the part to help her. I'll help make sure she's allowed to stay. You
Right.
know.
Well, it's an offer and an ultimatum because she basically just says, I will sit and pose for her, but no one else. You can't
Right.
fire her and hire someone else. Only her. Um, and that's what allows it to happen. Um, and in the meantime, we also have kind of a subplot with Sophie, the maid, who has been in on it from the beginning, um, but kind of outside of that relationship too, like friendly with both, but it is clear she is a servant. She is not like would not consider it her place to tell either Marianne or Heloise what to do, right? That said, it's clear she has opinions, and she also has been helping with the portrait. Like she was acting as a double to wear the fancy dress for
Yeah.
the portrait before. But then also we discover that just as the mother is leaving, we discover that she's pregnant and had already made plans to have it taken care of. And in this setting, that basically means going to the local midwife and getting certain herbs and that sort of thing. But she also makes it clear I was waiting for the mistress to leave um, before I did it. And so this also brings Marianne and Heloise closer because the two of them basically team up to help Sophie the maid do what she needs to do.
And honestly, until you kind of talked about like the whole theory of like this is a movie about women who don't need men, but like it's
Mm-hmm.
also like it's like women helping women.
Mm-hmm.
I yes, it helped them grow closer, but I don't know. This was like one part of the plot where it was just like I don't know. It didn't not feel right to me. It was
Mm-hmm.
just like it was a little bit of a different tone, or I don't know.
Yeah.
It didn't seem right to me. But now that I get it, it's like oh, this is them
Mm-hmm.
teaming up to help another woman, and like there's sort of this, you know,
Mm-hmm.
help again, just helping each other out, right?
Right.
And then
Well, and yeah, yeah, and the theme of women helping each other out is brought even deeper when they attend like this bonfire that the local women are doing. And
yep,
there's communal singing and everything. And this is honestly our first indication other than Sophie's existence that there are even any other people on this island.
right,
But it's all women at this bonfire, and there's some really lovely singing in. I think I read somewhere that it was Latin. Like the words of the song they were singing. Yeah, okay. In the festival scene, the women sing "Fugere non possum" continuously, and it's Latin for "I cannot escape," which I think is kind of interesting. So that wasn't necessarily the vibe that I got from that scene.
Yeah.
But in any case, it is at that bonfire that Heloise's skirt briefly catches fire, and she doesn't realize right away. And uh, Marianne is just, you know, gobsmacked by this image. And even though she doesn't like rush over to try to like paint it right away or anything, we obviously, having seen the painting from the beginning in the framing device, understand, okay, this is what that comes from in the literal sense. But it's also, you know, lots of other stuff going on. And so, like, and in this time, this is where, you know, just to entertain each other, the three women, when they're just hanging out, you know, like they're reading to each other, and they read the story of Orpheus and Eurydice, and they are talking about like the meaning of it, because Sophie in particular has, you know, like is totally unfamiliar with the story. And when she hears the part where, you know, Orpheus is bringing Eurydice out of the underworld and is told, you know, but you can't look back. But he does, and she is pulled back to the underworld. Of course, that's the tragedy. That's the classic mythology, right?
Yep.
But Sophie is mad because she's saying they told him not to. Why did he do it? And so there's some initial discussion of like, you know, well, was it fear? Was it uncertainty? Is there maybe a possibility that he wanted, like Marianne suggests it's the poet's answer, because he would rather have the memory of her than the actuality of her. And so he did it basically like deliberately, because the memory of their relationship, tragic as its ending was, is something he can like work with, as opposed to the reality of an actual relationship. But then it is Heloise that says, introducing Eurydice's agency for the first time in any analysis I've ever heard of this myth, maybe Eurydice told him to do it. You know, and sort of initially we can all imagine, well, why would she though, right? But it's a valid question, and I was actually really surprised when that came up, because it just made me realize, in all the analysis I've ever heard about that story, it is all about what Orpheus is thinking in that moment, and not about what does Eurydice want, because it's always just assumed that of course she wants to come back to life and be with Orpheus. And what are her other thoughts and feelings or interiority? We don't, you know, it doesn't come up. And so that, of course, becomes relevant later, because after having that story, Marianne starts having kind of like sort of nightmare fantasies,
Yeah.
imagining the future that seems inevitable, which is that she is going to be separated from Heloise and there won't be anything she can do about it. And so like she keeps having this image where she can't help but look back and see Heloise disappear. Like Heloise standing there in a wedding dress and
Yep.
then disappear. Right? And it's just, it starts to build this, you know, like as much as we're seeing them fall in love and enjoying that, we're this dread of the approaching end, without really there being any kind of obvious way that they could do anything about that. And then what it kind of comes down to is, you know, they're in their actual parting. It is Heloise saying, look back, you know, like, you know, I know that, you know, our mutual paths here are diverging, but I want you to have the memory of this relationship. I want you to be able to look back and see me. I can't follow you where you're going, but I want you to remember me. And then I just thought that was a really neat recontextualization of that whole myth. But of course, there's also, you know, like they had, you know, finally they had, you know, had I was just trying to decide whether to say sex or intimate relations, but um, they had slept with one another, and they had decided to. So Marianne had made her own little mini painting of Heloise and said, "It's it's like, who's that one for? That one's for me to keep, right?" And so then she also makes a sketch of herself in one of Heloise's books. So Heloise will also have a keepsake. And it's significant that they choose page 28 from the book, that she's got. The trivia page suggests that it's because 8 turned on its side is infinity, so it's like the two of them forever is meaning. I don't know if that, like, they actually chose it for that real reason or not, but yeah, maybe.
Maybe.
I gasped when we're back in the framing device, and Marianne is saying, the next time I saw her, it is when she has found, years later, a new portrait painted of her and her young son. And there's this feeling of kind of loss, but also like, okay, well, but she has a son. Maybe the son can bring her some joy. She looks like she's kind of in that portrait, maybe kind of wistful. It's a little hard to read, and we don't really know. But then you look down, and in her lap, she is holding a book and has her thumb in the pages, and you can just see that she is holding open this book in the painting to page 28. And it's just like this, like, she remembers too. And it's this joyful moment, and I kind of almost thought that the movie would just like end there, but instead, like, I don't know, we're just talking about it beat by beat now, but there had
Yeah, I
been
was gonna say we probably can't do that for There Will Be Blood.
no, but like, so there was we go back to, like, there had been an earlier scene where there was some tension between them, where they're playing the piano, and or I guess Marianne is playing the piano, and Heloise hasn't really heard a lot of music. She had missed hearing music because just like no one could play it there at that house. There wasn't anyone around, and uh, oh, so this is before the reveal of like why she's really there. And Marianne kind of just says, "Well, when you go to Milan, there's lots of music in Milan. Maybe that will be nice." And so Heloise is kind of like angry, is like, "Oh, so you're saying that the silver lining here is that there might be some moments where I will be consoled?" You're trying to talk me into it by saying like there will be some times when it's okay. um, but they are also just finding joy with each other in sharing like this particular piece of music. And so the actual end of the movie, we have, you know, Marianne goes to the symphony and happens to see Heloise in another box, and we have a long shot of Heloise listening to the symphony perform this same piece of music. And, we sometimes joke about like a face journey or something, but this is like a 3-minute shot of just her having like every emotion possible listening to this music, because it is the sort of thing of like, it reminds her of Marianne, and that's kind of sad, but also she's happy to remember happy times, and also the music is beautiful, but she's also maybe not happy in her marriage, but maybe she is sometimes, and maybe, so it's one of those things where it's sad to think your life is one that you have to be consoled sometimes, and yet this is some consolation. It's like, it's all of these things, and her performance in that scene is just amazing. So, like,
Yes.
this is a beautiful movie, and we have just spoiled everything if you haven't seen it already, but it's wonderful. I loved this movie.
Yes. All of those things happen. Uh, no, it's a very very good movie, and that's why, like I talked about, like the fact, like if you are interested in this movie, if you haven't watched it and now you know the end, but I would still encourage
Oh, yeah.
it. It's, I mean, it's top whatever 30. I think it was 30th or
Mhm.
something on the all-time greatest
Yeah.
films on the single list. It's worth watching, and if you start it, then kind of like I did, if it's taking you a minute to get into it, that's actually okay
Mhm.
because it's drawing you into this world on purpose, right? Like you're coming in slowly, like just like they are, like they're starting their
Mhm.
relationship slowly, and then like again, one of the metaphors of fire is like there's a sort of this kindling of this relationship that has
Mhm.
like this slow burn that
Yeah.
eventually turns into what it is and then extinguishes,
Mhm.
right? There's also the metaphor you said there are layers, that she's the lady on fire because she's got like this passion within her,
Mhm.
and that's why the portrait isn't right because it doesn't show the fire in her, it shows her
Mhm.
half smiling.
Yeah.
And then there's obviously she catches on fire and there's a picture of a
Mhm.
portrait of her actually on fire
In the
is
yeah,
what
in the poster, yeah.
starts the movie.
Yeah. Um
Yeah.
so you were right. You got it exactly right that it's number 30 on the Sight and Sound magazine top 100. And just like on that, that same sort of final note, we did sort of talk about everything that happens, but at the same time, we mentioned in the framing device, we're set up to know that we're going to have at best a bittersweet, story, right? And so in some ways, this is not a movie that spoiling things is really like this is not the sort of story that is really that diminished by hearing those things because it is the experience of watching it happen that is what's beautiful about it.
Yep.
But so with uh, with all of that said, let's move on to our next film. There Will Be Blood, uh, starring Daniel Day Lewis and Paul Dano, and directed by Paul Thomas Anderson. And this is the one that we had both seen. But talk a little bit about why you chose to revisit it. It's certainly on the top, this top movies list. But why did you choose this one?
Um, I don't remember if I gave a reason last time when I chose it. I think
I
I
mean, I
just
think it was just
felt
something to the effect of you felt like watching it again.
yeah, okay, good, because that's what
Right.
I was about to say, and I was like, I hope they didn't give a deeper reason that I'm not remembering. Yes, I felt like watching it again. I remember this movie, like I remember thinking this was a interesting movie, a good movie, a well shot movie, great performed movie, but I didn't remember. I remember there were some great scenes in it. I didn't remember why they were great. Like it was just kind of like, I mean, it's been 15 years, right? Like it's what I what made this good. I wanted to see that again,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like it was like, okay, this movie obviously has some staying power since it made this list. So let's go back and watch it again.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm really glad we did, um, because I don't, just like anything, like what's the quote? Like a man never steps in the same river twice,
Mm.
because the river's always changing and the man's always changing, right?
Yeah.
But in this case, it's like when you watch a movie that has this much depth to it,
Mm-hmm.
like who you are as a person and where you are says it changes how you interpret it,
Oh
right?
yeah, absolutely.
And so to come at this as just a more well-seasoned adult, I guess is the best way to say it,
Mm-hmm.
someone who's just been and experienced more and has seen more people who are not I mean there's nobody, obviously nobody exactly like this, like
Yeah.
it's a hyper real character,
Mm-hmm.
um but seeing people with these tendencies of this, like seeing opportunities to make decisions
Mm-hmm.
where you could do something that was maybe slightly like this but could
Mm-hmm.
gain you this, and like having gone through that as a person, like to watch just this focused thing of like what happens if like you are just and we talk about this all the time, like with jobs and goals and things like this, like, oh, you got to be hyper focused on your goals. Well, yes, but
Mm-hmm.
here's a guy who was hyper focused on his goals, right? And
Yeah.
look what happened to him.
Mm-hmm.
right? So, loosely, this is a movie about a man who Daniel
Plainview.
Daniel Plainview, um, is a guy who's trying to take part in the oil boom and trying to discover oil, but
Mm-hmm.
he has this goal of just being. And it's this weird thing is his goal is actually just to like be the greatest oil man ever, to the point where he even says there's even a scene where he
Mm-hmm.
says like sometimes I just want to destroy the other person,
Yeah.
right? Like the
Like,
competitiveness of it, right? Yeah,
yeah. Like what he wants seems to be pretty abstract. He kind of just wants to be like the best around. Like he doesn't want to ever be able to look he doesn't want to ever have to look at another person and think that that person has something over him.
right. Whether it's money, power, yeah, all these things. He wants
Mm-hmm.
all of everything. And the movie, you can get broad strokes, and then we can kind of dive into some of the other
Yeah, yeah,
pieces.
yeah.
Like the movie begins with him, spending a inordinate amount of time. Like you almost forget that. Like it takes him several years
Yeah.
to like mine the first bit of oil. But then he's a really intelligent guy, so he figures out how to get the oil out quickly. He starts to think of like ways to accumulate more oil land, and then and that just snowballs from there, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
he just starts to build this little empire, and then that's where we're introduced to Paul Dano, which I
Mm-hmm.
actually questioned after I finished this about Paul Dano's character that I haven't resolved for myself.
Okay, yeah, yeah.
Um, so Paul Dano comes to him and says, "Hey, you're doing really well at this. Everybody's talking about. I'm looking for somebody to come and pay to drill for oil on our family's land."
Mm-hmm.
And invites him out to come look at it. It's very difficult to drill in.
Mm-hmm.
Comes out, befriends the family. Oh, I forgot there's this other piece where one of his partners dies and has a young son, and
Well,
he
I
uh,
want I want to talk about that, but I'll just put a pin in it and we'll keep going with the general plot.
yeah, like all these things I want to talk about, but I was
Mm-hmm.
going to try to my goal was to try to cover very broad strokes so that we could dive into like the interesting pieces.
Mm-hmm.
And um so anyway, one of his partners dies. He has a young son, so he adopts him and starts the orphan son and starts bringing him basically as his business partner to present himself as a
Mm-hmm.
family man.
Yeah.
That's part of how he grows his business.
Mm-hmm.
And then Paul Sunday, which is Paul Dano's character, tells him
Well,
about.
yeah.
Yeah,
So that like Paul Dano technically is playing twins.
yes, and that's
Yeah.
the part I want to talk about.
Okay.
Um, so he meets his twin Eli
Mm-hmm.
and his family. He does his song and dance, decides to, wants to buy the land, and then Eli starts to demand money for his church because Eli is a pastor and he's also ambitious,
Mm-hmm.
but he's not quite as talented in his ambition as we kind of learn, but
Yeah.
he's focused on growing his church, and so he, negotiates to try to get some money for the church.
Mm-hmm.
Then Daniel reneges on that, and they which that is key because then they start to drill on the land and they start to have like a series of like accidents.
Mm-hmm.
And it's, there's sort of, again, we'll get into like whether that's supposed to mean or whether I think it's ambiguous. It's like you
Mm-hmm.
sort of interpret it however you want. Is like, was his rejection of helping the church part of why this didn't work because he couldn't bless it and like,
Mm-hmm.
which is what Eli obviously says.
Right.
And so Eli's demanding the money. Daniel humiliates him. Like these guys have like this clash of a relationship from the beginning. They're
Mm-hmm.
both very ambitious. One is ambitious in money and power. One is ambitious in what ostensibly we believe in spreading the faith of the church,
Mm-hmm.
but ultimately is also revealed he's kind of a power hungry guy as
Yeah.
well,
Mm-hmm.
and the church is his vehicle.
Right.
So that's part of it, right? And so they continue
Yeah.
to interact throughout the whole movie. Um, then you start to, I mean, there's and then all these other kind of weird things that would happen, like on a hero's journey, right? Like, so Daniel has a brother that shows up,
Mm-hmm.
and he's like, oh man, he's loving that he's got a brother, and then he starts to suspect something, tests him with like a old joke or something. I forget exactly what he did. So there was something
Yeah.
he said that I should have responded a certain way,
Mm-hmm.
and then realizes that like he's not his brother. His brother died, and this guy impersonated him, and you know that's becomes you know it's one of the first times he actually shows emotion, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
he's actually sad,
Yeah.
and that's a critical thing to talk about because there's another piece later that I think these are two of this scene where he gets drunk and like cries
Mm-hmm.
about his brother actually being dead and him being taken by a guy pretending to be his brother.
Mm-hmm.
It's like it's one of the most powerful two scenes in the movie for me, right?
Yeah.
So he ends up killing him. Oh, I think those that happen in reverse, but either way.
Well, I mean, I think I remembered like the crying is after, is what I thought, but I,
Yeah, yeah, but I don't believe he was crying because he killed a man. I believe he
well,
was crying because he missed his brother and
I think, yeah,
that guy was his brother.
I feel like there's also a layer there related to the son, right? Because the son had had the accident where that left him deaf
Yeah,
and
kind of.
was really
Yeah, really
struggling
skipped.
there, and um, Daniel is having a really difficult time, like adjusting to that and trying to like meet his son's needs now that he's deaf. Um, and you can see that he puts some effort into trying, but is really kind of not willing to like change his own behavior. Really, like he wants his son to try to work hard to be back to normal when that's probably just not really possible. And their relationship is strained at that point, right? It's very fragile. But then when the brother shows up, the son is immediately suspicious of this guy, in part because Daniel seems extremely ready to essentially just replace him.
Yeah,
And so he
looking for
tries,
that companionship, that family connection.
yeah,
Yeah,
so he tries to warn Daniel about it. Daniel not only refuses to believe him, but ships him off to a school for the deaf for his own good,
yep.
which actually is probably actually a good thing for him to go to that school. But it's very clear in the moment that this is happening because, I've got a new business partner, family member now, and you're messing it up and you're not good enough for me anymore. So I'm going to send you away. Like, that's the emotional context, even though, like, you could imagine rational justifications for why all of those things happen, but that's what it feels like to the son in that moment. And so then when Daniel realizes that he's been taken in, there's also the layer of realizing what did he do to his relationship with his son
Yeah. That,
as
no, that's
part of
great
that.
context because that ties into like what I think is the second most, or the actually the most powerful scene in the movie. But that, yes, that's good. I was
Mm-hmm.
flying through this
Sure, no, no,
too.
that's yeah, it's
Yeah,
it's
but no,
a it's
that
a
is
very
important. Yes,
dense
in one of
layered
the
movie.
accidents, his son gets hurt and all these
Mm-hmm.
things happen, right? And then, um, so then we get into more of the like the friction between Daniel and the church because uh I think it's Eli's dad, I think, right? Like knows what he's done and then like wants him to go repent and then or no, that's not. It's Bandy, the guy that yeah, the guy with this other guy with a bunch of land. Again,
Mm-hmm.
there's all this complicated stuff with the oil stuff, but another guy has a
Yeah.
bunch of land that he's trying to acquire, knows
Mm-hmm.
what he's done, and
Right.
says, "You've got to go to Eli's church, and then I will let you run the pipeline."
Mm-hmm.
Right? And then Eli baptizes Daniel, but then also humiliates him, like
Yeah.
makes him confess about abandoning him his son, like just really humiliates, like takes that, and that's
Yeah.
where you start to realize that like Eli, like we kind of already had gotten it, but that's where we
Mm-hmm.
start to realize like this is not a good guy either.
Daniel Day Lewis is amazing in this movie, but that scene in particular is incredible because you watch in that scene Daniel going from a starting point of this sucks. I hate that I have to do this, but I might as well just suck it up and get through it because this is what I need to do for the business. And then
Yep.
as it's going on, he's just increasingly going, this asshole. I can't believe he's doing this to me. And then it starts to turn where like a little more personal, where you can see that there's a part of him that's actually starting to like really think about some of the stuff he's being made to confess, and you can see some maybe real shame and sadness start to get in there. But then when Eli slaps him, all of a sudden there's a fire in his eye where you can imagine he's just immediately saying to himself, I am going to kill this man someday. And suddenly he's not ashamed or humiliated anymore. It is like every new indignity is like, oh, just you wait. I'm saving this up to return to you with interest.
Yes. So he's got that, and then it makes sense later, but there's this like weird part of the movie where the Bandy properties where the pipeline, like that gets, I can't remember exactly how, but Eli ends up with control of it.
Mm-hmm.
Then they're talking about ways how you can maybe get it to the sea. Like there's a lot of like kind of code speak of like this
Mm-hmm.
oil stuff, and they're measuring things, and you're
Yeah.
not sure exactly what's happening until it all like comes together at the end, right? And
Mm-hmm.
so you know he eventually, like, then we go to the future, and this is like we can probably cover this as like this scene in and of itself is like a 30-minute scene. It's probably the most
Mm-hmm.
famous scene for me movie, but I'll just do the broad strokes. He's alone, he's drunk, he's bitter. His son comes to him and
Yeah.
wants to have his own drilling company, and his reaction to him is to just mock him,
Mm-hmm.
tell him he's an orphan, like just belittle him, like drive him out of his life, right?
Yeah.
Like it's the saddest thing that you can watch. Like,
It's awful.
yeah, it's awful,
It,
right?
it it is, and it's the thing is that as painful as we can imagine this being for the son, it's almost sadder from the other side because you recognize how self-destructive he's being.
Yes. And then we have what, in the context of watching the movie, just seems like sort of an aside of a scene. Like there's he has this sad memory of his adopted son as a kid, like when they were younger and they were still building the business, and he was
Mm-hmm.
playing around and wearing his hat and like joking. And again, why I think that's the most powerful scene is when this all concludes and he's reached this descent. Like that's like the most, that thinking back on that scene, that becomes the most painful scene because he
Mm-hmm.
truly, everything he said there, you just realize was just absolutely wrong. Like he didn't mean it. He loved that kid.
Mm-hmm.
He
Well,
just was so focused on this that he left his own son, who, even if it wasn't his blood,
mm-hmm.
he left him behind, and he drove him away. And it's heartbreaking when you look back,
Yeah.
like just a weird little like montage, and you're
Yeah.
just like, but you realize that like it what it does is take this hyper real person and give him a humanity that is even sadder.
Well,
As
he's a complicated guy.
yeah,
And for sure, one of the things, this is where I want to take the pin out from where I pinned it
yeah,
earlier, which
yeah. Let's
is
go back through.
I put the pin in it because you said in a straightforward way, one of his coworkers dies, his partners dies, and had this orphan kid that he kind of adopts. I want to challenge that a little bit because what do we actually see on screen? I think that that is a very reasonable interpretation of what happens. But what we see on screen is there's no baby until there's an accident and they discover, is it oil already, or is it just gold? I think at that point.
No, I
And
think it was oil because I think didn't he drown in the oil or something weird.
oh yeah, yeah. And so like they find the oil, and so now they have a bigger operation, right? And so, but what happens is it's just a couple of guys out in the middle of nowhere trying to build a well, And there's an accident at the same time that they find oil, and one of the other guys gets killed in that accident. Cut to, it's a bigger operation, and Daniel now has a baby with him. It's easy to assume what you said is the straightforward explanation. But the movie does not ever explicitly say that.
I I love that potential interpretation, that conflict of interpretation, because that actually leads into the thing that I put a pin in,
Mm-hmm.
which is the twins. And I tried to go back, like I forgot about it when I was first watching through this whole thing, and then I
Mm-hmm.
tried to go back and realize it's also unclear if Eli has always been purporting to be the guy who came and met him, and not really like it. They don't ever talk about how he has a twin, right? Like he
Yeah.
recognizes it, and he says, "Oh, Paul," and he goes, "Eli," and it's almost like at that point,
Yeah.
does Eli think that does
Well,
he think Paul was using a fake name when he was trying to solicit him? And all and
yeah.
you never
Well,
and I could not find a scene where it was ever definitively until the very end
mhm.
when he says, "Oh, hey, by the way, you're the worst twin. I found your brother. He's working for me, and
Mm-hmm.
here you are begging for money."
Yeah.
Like, and so I was trying to figure out. I was like, that
So,
was like a weird thing too. Like,
yeah.
did Eli think that he thought he was Paul, or did
Yeah.
Eli know he didn't know he was
I
Paul?
think that there's some nuance here, but the explanation I would give for that, like first, some background stuff that I think is interesting, is that Paul Dano was originally cast as Paul Sunday and not Eli. But then the actor who was gonna be Eli had to back out, and they decided to have Paul Dano play both characters and make them twins. That wasn't originally the idea. They were going to
Hmm.
be brothers, but not identical twins. I think, from a straightforward way, that first meeting is Paul who says, I
Yes.
want to get out. I want you to come and buy out my family's land so that I can leave that place. And it's never really stated, but once we meet Eli, we can understand why. Um, when he shows up, Paul is not there and it's Eli, but Daniel doesn't know that they're twins. And so he sees the guy who looks just like the one he talked to, who is
Yep.
now claiming to be a different person. And even though he eventually is able to accept the explanation that it's because they're twins, there is definitely a fraught moment where he feels like, is he fucking with me? What is this? Why is he pretending to be a different person? And it creates a real tension in that scene, that I think is really interesting. But I think, in a straightforward way, that is what happened. Is the first meeting was Paul, and then it was Eli, and there was never deception, but there was confusion on Daniel's part that matters.
So I my thought on the deception was the reverse.
Okay.
That yes, it was Paul for sure in the meeting, like all the straightforward stuff.
Mm-hmm.
But when I sometimes took like it was almost like confusing. Did Eli take the fact that he was confused about that to kind of pretend like he was still the guy that brought him there? Like that
I mean,
he and Paul were the same person. But it never says that one way there. But it also really never talks about like he never brings up Paul again
mm-hmm.
until the very end. So I don't think it was
Yeah,
meant. I think it was just one of those things where it's like same point. Like the baby's there, you make this
mm-hmm.
assumption. Like you
Yeah.
make this assumption, like okay,
I,
like this is what it was. But it's almost like did Eli deceive him the other way and say like I'm the guy that brought you here. That's why you need to like kowtow to me a little bit, right?
I
Like
mean, maybe. Like I had never interpreted it that way. That's an interesting thought. Like my thinking had always just been, Eli's position is, I don't care what my stupid brother told you. I'm the one that lives here on this land. He's the one that wants to leave. And so just because he showed up and brought you here doesn't mean you don't still have to deal with me and make me happy now.
Right.
And
Which
so that I think that was my impression of Eli's attitude, and I don't think he was necessarily deliberately trying to deceive him as much as he recognized that Daniel didn't understand it at first and corrects him in a way that makes Daniel feel small, which is just planting the
the
seed
beginning
for
of
all
how
of the
they,
tension between them, right?
yeah, that probably
So
makes sense.
Daniel does not like being embarrassed by being confused, not realizing what's happening. And so there's an accidental deception that makes Daniel mad regardless of whether it was intentional or not.
Yeah, I think that does make sense. Yeah.
That was always my interpretation, but I think
But my interpretation was always that the
well
baby was eating their guys.
yeah,
Yeah.
and I'm not even saying that that's not what it is,
Right.
but when we consider that the baby's provenance is unclear, layer that back again with that final scene where he is essentially self destructing by driving his son away. And he tells him, what does he tell him? He tells him, I bought you.
Bought you. Yeah.
And what we know is once he has this baby, once we see him as a kid, he's immediately using the fact that I'm a family man is the way he gets people to listen to him. He knows that he could be potentially seen as intense and off-putting otherwise, but he's a family man. Look, it's a family business. Here's my boy right here. Like that is a whole big part of his shtick that
Mhm.
he make like and it works for him, right? And so we can imagine a world where now that there's actual oil that they're going to have to sell to people, are people going to be more likely to sell to a weirdo out in the desert or a man who's tragically lost his wife and has a young son and also oil to sell? And so like I'm not saying it's definitive because I think the movie is deliberately ambiguous with it just by not telling us where he gets the baby. I think it's quite possible that it is exactly what you said. But either way, we could imagine that whether he buys a baby or whether it is that deceased coworker's baby, regardless, we can imagine the only reason he has chosen to care for this baby is because he thinks it will help him in the business. He's not exactly the paternal type.
No, but I think I agree.
Mm-hmm.
And the other piece, which you also mean by introducing that, you
Mm-hmm.
introduce this a potentially third option,
Yeah.
and that it is in fact his son
Mm-hmm.
out of wedlock
I
that
mean, the story that he tells people, for all we know, could be true. There is a time jump, right? It's not a long one, but there is some. And like it could be that he did have there could have been a relationship with the mother that we just never saw on screen,
or even not a relationship in the
or just
comic
yeah, like
like
right. So
a
it
brief
could be
relationship.
right. Like
Yeah.
so, I mean, there's any number of different possibilities, but it's also true that we're not sure which it is. He definitely I think it's also true that even if the reason he decides I am now going to be a single father raising a son is because he thinks that will help him in the business, does not mean that he doesn't come to actually love and care for his son, but it is complicated because certainly once his son is less able to fulfill that part of the business relationship, there's a tension there. The
Yeah.
relationship doesn't work like it did anymore before. You know,
And it shows also like again his descent of character,
yeah.
right? Like it's one thing to sort of pose as something you're not exact like you he is a family man because the kid does live with him and he does take care of him,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like so yes, he's not a family man in the way that
Right.
he's
I mean, he
portraying
becomes a
himself.
family man on purpose, right? Like he decides to become a family man non
Right.
traditionally.
Which is not a good thing to do, but it's
Mm-hmm.
like it's sort of the first step into like
Right.
how far they're willing to go,
Right.
right? And then reneging on on Eli's
Well,
deal.
like, and
Right?
even
Like,
that,
okay,
like,
well, yeah, this guy's kind of, I can understand, like, this guy's kind of being shady with me. Like,
mhm,
I just want the land. I don't need to deal with his church thing. I'm
yeah,
whatever. And it just keeps going and going and going to till it gets to the point of like, I'm sending my son away.
mhm,
Okay, now I'm circumnavigating this guy's land and stealing all of his oil,
yeah,
you know, to I'm killing people for being people that get in my way, right?
yeah.
And those are all different steps
I
on
want
the
to
way.
touch back on
Yeah,
reneging on his deal with Eli too, because again, this is not an example where it is just as simple as I promised money and now I'm not going to give you the money. What it really comes down to, and it feels like it is really this second spur of the moment decision, is when Eli is saying, "You're going to have me come and open this up with you, and you're going to introduce me, and I'm going to give you the words to say, and I'm going to make it seem, I'm going to have you make it seem to everyone else that I am just as important as you in this whole thing." And it is Daniel refusing to do that, and being so mad about being asked to do that that he basically pulls back everything else that he was going to do, right? And so, like, it's not even just a matter of like, oh, I promised to pay a bill and now I'm stiffing you on the check,
right.
right? Like, it
No, that's
was,
great.
again, I refuse to let you act like you have leverage on me.
Yep.
And eventually he discovers that Eli does have some degree of leverage on him, outmaneuvers him in a couple of key ways that leads to that whole bit where he feels like he has to allow himself to be baptized and humiliated in that way. But then, just as awful as Daniel is and as tragic as his descent towards the end is, Eli is also awful. He is
Yes.
not the good guy that we feel bad for. Like, he's terrible. And he's such a hypocrite about so much of it. It is really all about his own glory, even as much as he says that it's not. But there is something really cathartic and satisfying, like, not even the final violence, but just the final bit where it feels like once the relationship with the son is broken, before even that final confrontation where it ends like completely, but just like once it's not what it was anymore, it feels like making the money and running the business is just a machine that runs itself now. And Daniel is essentially just waiting. He has nothing else now except waiting for the moment that he has known will come all along, which is when Eli finally agrees to come and try to sell him the oil, and he can spring the trap that he has known about for years, which
Mm-hmm.
is, you can't. You have none.
I already
I
got
drained it
one.
out from under you while you weren't paying attention because you don't understand how this business works.
And he
I
gets
let
the
you think you had it all this time.
yeah. And
Mm-hmm.
the added part of being able to humiliate him, even if it's
Mm-hmm.
only in private,
Yeah.
in the same way that he was humiliated
Yeah.
earlier,
Mm-hmm.
and where he, makes him call himself a false prophet because he, Eli has overextended his church missionary, and now
Yeah.
he needs money. So he comes in like he got this leverage, and he comes in tough, and Daniel's
Mm-hmm.
pushing back, and then Eli finally breaks down and was like, I need you. Like, we have this history together, and it's like, oh yeah, we do.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So here's what I need you to do. You need to
Yeah.
declare like you're giving a sermon, and this is a phenomenal performance by Paul Dano.
Oh yeah, they're both incredible in this movie.
Yeah, because he's going through the same thing that, like, Daniel Day Lewis was earlier, where he says the words, right, like, I am a false prophet.
Mm-hmm.
He goes, no, you mean it. I am a false prophet. And he was like, no, like, you're giving one of your sermons.
Mm-hmm.
Eventually, like, crescendos into that same character, like that preacher character of like, I am a false prophet, and like starts doing all the motions, and it's like
Mm-hmm.
it's so humiliating for him.
Mm-hmm.
but he needs the money. And he's like, finally, okay, so will you buy the land? And he goes, no.
Mm-hmm.
You know,
It's worthless. I
it's
let
worth.
you think all this time that you had it over me and that you were holding this as your secret reserve, that you were keeping it from me, wielding power over me. But I have known all along, and this is, of course, the I drink your milkshake bit,
Yeah,
where he's just, he's basically just saying, I bought up all the land around it and drilled so deep that it just lowers the whole oil table under your land too. You have nothing. I used a long straw to
yeah.
drink
I use a
your
long
milkshake.
straw, and I
Hmm.
drink all your milkshake. Yeah,
Yeah, and it's just amazing to realize that Daniel must have been holding on to this for years, just waiting for when Eli finally comes to him and tries to use that as a bargaining chip. Because it's you mentioned the final line of like I'm finished, because we can imagine, when we do the time jump, we come to him in this enormous house all by himself, drunk off his ass and shooting a, what is it, a shotgun or just a rifle, shooting his own possessions because he has nothing. Like, he's got this great big house and doesn't care about any of it. None of that is important to him. And we have the feeling that like he set up the business like it's a machine. It doesn't even really need him at this point. It's just churning out money, and he doesn't care about any of it. And we can imagine watching that final scene with Eli that for years he has had nothing in his life except waiting for this moment.
yep.
It's
And
it's
it
really
come and
pretty
yeah,
good.
and it comes right off of like him casting his son away for the final time,
Yeah.
right? And the depression
Yeah.
of that,
For
what
the
all that.
crime of feeling like I don't get along with you anymore and I feel like I want to run my own business and be my own man like you were. But for that treachery, he must be destroyed. Even though, like, as we talked about, like, as much as all of that fire is being directed outward, it is coming from him hollowing out his own soul.
Yes.
Yeah. Ah, it's a good movie. Um, it's funny you introduced it all with the whole like cannot step into the same river twice thing, just because it makes me think about the difference between when I first saw this movie and then revisiting it. Um, I'll say I like it a lot more than I did the first time. Not that I didn't like it before, but it was always one of those movies that I kind of admired more than I enjoyed. You know,
That's a good call.
I
I gotta
struggle.
You keep
Mhm.
talking. I'm
Okay,
listening. I
yeah.
just have to shut the door quick.
As we have certainly discussed in the past, I often struggle with films where I don't feel like I have anyone I can root for. It's one of the reasons that I have some reservations in my enjoyment of the Godfather movies, for example, which I can certainly recognize excellent filmmaking on display, performances, writing, all of that stuff. But I kind of don't actually just really enjoy watching it. I don't find that a pleasant experience. And I kind of felt the same way about this one at first. And although there's still a piece of that here, like I will say, I think there are other Paul Thomas Anderson movies that I like more, because I think this one is like cold is not the right word, but like ugly in a way that some of
Yeah.
his others are more beautiful in a way that I enjoy more, in a difference between good bad versus enjoy or distaste. You know what I mean? Like, I enjoy others more, but the filmmaking on display here is just amazing, and there's so much nuance to it that I definitely like it more than I used to, even if I still sometimes prefer some others like uh, Boogie Nights, Magnolia, Phantom Thread. I think I would still put higher than this one in my own personal list. But boy, this is a great movie.
Yeah, I think I kind of already covered mine. I mean, I think it's for me. I definitely enjoyed it more,
Hmm.
and I think it's just because I've been around people who've been striving for success, who have made choices. I've confronted choices. Nothing to the extent of this, and so to watch that and kind of think back through like why you want to be a person of integrity, like
Hmm.
why you want to make good decisions, like why, if you're a person of faith, you want to be not a hypocrite and like actually true to the faith, right?
Hmm.
Like that's, that it's ugly when someone proclaims that and then utilizes that to gain for their own ends. Like those
Hmm.
kinds of things those are ugly. And the
Yeah.
movie's ugly, right? And it reinforces like values in yourself. Like you're like, so it was like weird to kind of go through that, like almost like, so I'm really glad we did rewatch it. And again, it was just kind of a weird feeling I had. I'd like to rewatch this.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. One note too, just in terms of what I was saying about like not having anyone to root for, I will say that I had kind of always just felt like that was a very straightforward way to describe this, but I will say that watching it this time, I realized that there is a little bit of lightness in there, if only to kind of contrast everything of Daniel's son marrying Mary Sunday. Because that
yep.
is just such a nice, sweet little relationship that's just pure and wholesome between them. And the two of them together get away from all the horrible people in their lives.
Yes. I,
And
I was
so,
about to say the same thing. I was like, if you want somebody to root for, like root for
yeah.
HW.
Mm-hmm.
Because yeah, the girl that, he got brought along with this plot of land and this family that like
Mm-hmm.
did all this stuff. And then there's this other family member that we sort of don't worry about, who he just plays with
Mm-hmm.
and then falls in love with and marries. And like, yeah, I mean, it's great.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So
And
that's a nice.
and I don't root like, this is a weird way to put it. Like I
Mm-hmm.
don't root for this the whole movie, but again, why that transitional scene between driving his son away and
Mm-hmm.
his confrontation with Eli, where he has the memories of his son,
Mm-hmm.
like it's like a bittersweet, like rooting for what this guy could have been.
Mm-hmm.
Like he's so smart. Like your point, he created this machine of a business. Like he's a really intelligent guy who knows
Mm-hmm.
how to do all these things, who knows how to, when he couldn't get the plot of land he wanted, he knows how to get to it. Like he's built an empire. Like he's basically a genius in this
Mm-hmm.
particular thing. And it's so sad. Like I'm rooting for the other version of him where he could still do things, but he could actually
Yeah.
give to humanity as opposed to just take.
Yeah.
You know,
Because
so it's a bittersweet root. Yeah,
to borrow the metaphor from the other movie, he's got a fire inside and it burns hot and bright, but he is not able to control it, and it ends up burning things that he would rather it didn't, including by the end himself.
yep. So
Yeah, but a pair of great movies. So,
yes,
this is the part of the episode where ordinarily we would be talking about what are our next movies, but in this case, the Oscar nominations are out. So instead, we are going to begin our 2024 Oscar movie marathon.
yes,
Um, if you are not familiar with our whole deal related to that, it is pretty straightforward. We each of us are tracking the movies that got Oscar nominations on a spreadsheet, and we're going to try before the award ceremony to see as many of them as we can. And we're not necessarily competing directly against each other. It's both just like we are each doing as many as we can within our own permitted schedules. So so it's not like a race. It is just, you know, an effort. And we have made our spreadsheet for this year, and the nominees are out. And I think because we've already spent a lot of time discussing other movies, we don't have to like read through all the nominations. Obviously, people can do that themselves, right? Like the nominations are everywhere. You can find them. You don't need us to read them to you. But um, what we can do is like to start. I ended up not quite as many as last year, which was an unusually high year for me. But I last year I had seen 7 of the 10 Best Picture nominees already by the time the nominations came out. This year, only 6.
I think I've seen 2.
Yeah. That said, the 2 that you saw both had a lot of nominations to them, and so
Did help,
for only
yeah.
having seen 2, you're already still at 21% of the total nominations. Um, and I think without going into detail, the detailed discussions that we'll have about some of these movies in future episodes, um, it is striking to me that the only sort of like initial discourse I've seen since the nominations came out were people angry that Barbie did not get a Best Director nomination for Greta Gerwig and a Best Actress nomination for Margot Robbie, while it did get a Best Supporting Actor nomination for Ryan Gosling. And I've seen lots of people pointing at that as though it's sexist and somehow emblematic of the movie. Although I have to say personally, as a fan of the Barbie movie and who like Margot Robbie and Greta Gerwig very much, I think that's a silly discourse personally. Um, I maybe would have liked to see them get those nominations, but it immediately becomes a question of like, okay, but who would they replace, right? Who is it that got the nomination that shouldn't have in place of them? It's kind of a numbers thing. People vote on these independently, and I don't think anyone decided that only the man gets a nomination. And even if they did, that ignores the fact that America Ferrera got a nomination for Best Supporting Actress also. So like people ignoring the fact that she actually did get a nomination when they want to pretend that it's only men that get it. Like that's I don't know. I was annoyed by that discourse personally.
I I'm glad to hear you say that because I was too. And
Hmm.
by the way, Greta Gerwig got nominated for the writing.
Yeah,
Like, so it's not like she's like left out.
right. It's also not like she has never been recognized before. Like her Little Women was wonderful. I love that movie, and that got pretty recognized, in the awards that year. So it's, I mean, this is a big movie, but I think sometimes people who have maybe only seen 1 or 2 of the movies in question and they're a big fan of it think that it should get everything. And so like you have people really mad that their favorite movie only got 8 nominations instead of 10.
Right. And the Golden Globes doesn't help this sometimes because it has more categories and
Mm-hmm.
stuff like that. So it's like it kind of feeds that like,
Yeah.
but I think they were great. Like
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I also I haven't seen enough of the best director to make a determination. I haven't
Mm-hmm.
seen enough of the best actresses. But traditionally, like unfortunately, like this
Yeah,
isn't a
they're
the
competitive
best actress
categories.
films like tend to be a different style of film. And
Yeah.
so if your complaint is that she didn't get that, maybe complain about what style of film constitutes a best actress, not,
Mm-hmm.
you know.
Well, it's also the sort of thing where it happens so often, but you have a situation where a person who has seen maybe one of the 5 actual nominees is really mad that their favorite didn't get nominated when they didn't even see most of the ones that did. And so how can you actually compare if you haven't even seen the ones that it's competing against? And like, okay, people can be fans of Barbie and still be mad and want it to get all the nominations, but it doesn't mean that it's indicative of some cultural trend when it's actually just people voting with the numbers, right? People like Ryan Gosling was great in that movie. Good for him. Margot Robbie and Greta Gerwig also, like Margot Robbie was great in her performance and Greta Gerwig was great as a director, but there's also lots of other moving pieces in this whole thing. I don't think there was anyone who decided, no, Stamp, I'm going to only allow this guy to get the nomination, because like even that like whole presentation kind of eludes the the part where a woman of color also did get a nomination, and they just leave that out when they're trying to make their point. And I'm like, that's not fun, you know. So like,
And that
let's chill a little bit on that.
Margot Robbie is not competing against five other women for Best Actress. Like
Yeah.
it's not like they put like a bunch of dudes in front of her.
Right. Yeah. It's
Yeah.
it's silly. Barbie's a great movie. People really liked it, and so I think sometimes when people, you get into like the stan culture thing of it, where people are not always rational about that sort of thing, and that's human, but also doesn't need to be treated as though it's a really thoughtful analysis.
Correct.
Yeah.
The last thing I'll say on this is that I think I told you this, but I have a new strategy to try to see more
Yeah.
movies because one of the things that's hurt me in my schedule is I tend to only have most nights like maybe an hour to watch and do like sort of my own thing just with
Mm-hmm.
my other responsibilities. And so it's always been like, well, I can't watch a movie in that time. So now I've decided I'm going to watch movies almost like TV series.
Mm-hmm.
And so while I haven't marked Killers of the Flower Moon on there, I am 2/3 of the way through Killers of the Flower Moon
Yeah.
because I have watched it in 2 1 hour
Mm-hmm.
segments, and it is a massively long movie.
Yeah. It is.
So I still have a third segment,
Mm-hmm.
but I've put that into practice, and I think I might be able to knock out a few more movies by doing that.
That's great.
Um,
I
yeah,
I think that I applaud that. I think like there are some movies that really benefit from being seen all through the way through in one sitting. But that said, if the alternative is not seeing it at all versus seeing it in chunks, see it in chunks. There's nothing wrong with that. It's like it's great, and it
and
allow
I
if
think
it
the
allows
fact
you to,
that
yeah.
like TV shows have gotten
Mm-hmm.
so good, like I'm more used to like processing a like complex story,
Mm-hmm.
being able to compartmentalize that, leave for the night, and then come back and re-engage with that
Yeah.
another time.
Mm-hmm.
And with TV series, like it may be a week and you have to re-engage with that like mindset.
Mm-hmm.
And because those things have gotten to that level, right? Like we're not watching sitcoms anymore,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like we're watching 8 hour movies,
Mm-hmm.
right? So I was like, that yes, there are some movies I would prefer to
Yeah.
sit and watch in one sitting. I'm glad I watched Portrait of a Lady in one sitting. I'm glad I watched There Will Be Blood in one sitting.
Mm-hmm.
And there will be some of these that I will do that with,
Yeah.
but there'll be others where I'm like, I would like to engage with this
Mm-hmm.
movie. I'd like to watch it.
Yeah.
I'll watch
I
it in chunks.
I
Yeah.
think that's a good idea. Um, but the one other nomination I was going to just comment on briefly is that for best animated feature, there's one of them that I haven't seen and didn't even really know anything about. I think it's a foreign language film that's like been barely released anywhere yet. But it's so I'm excited to see it, but I haven't seen it. But I will say, Elemental is one of the few that we've both seen, and what I'll say is I liked Elemental, but I think that Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles Mutant Mayhem should have been that in that spot.
I didn't watch Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles.
Mm-hmm.
I also liked Elemental. I felt
Mm-hmm.
like Elemental was more of a regurgitation of something of things they've already done with. I mean, it had different aspects
It's
to
it's
it.
a pastiche of some of their other films that they've done.
Pastiche.
Yeah.
That's not regurgitation. It's not the right word. Pastiche
Well,
is.
there's this all it all kind of blends.
Yeah.
Yeah. So like this is not saying Elemental is bad because I did enjoy it, but Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles Mutant Mayhem is an incredible movie. People should go watch that.
Nice.
But also, so are the other ones that I've seen already. So yeah. But that was the only other one that I had any kind of like really, like anything specific to say before we're ready to actually do our real discussion. But so at the very least, in our next episode, we will be able to talk about Elemental, which we've both seen, and Barbie and Oppenheimer. And then, of course, as we progress through our marathon and we've both seen more movies, we will, we can briefly touch on the ones that just one of us has seen. But we were going to spend our in-depth discussion on the ones that we both see. So the plan is that our next episode we'll talk about Barbie and Oppenheimer and Elemental, and then we'll see what's next as we plow through um, these nominations. And so the awards aren't till March 10th, so we've got a little while. So let the marathon begin.
There we go.
All right, so I think that'll do it then for tonight. So thank you everybody for listening and or watching, and join us on our marathon as we watch good movies.
Yay.